today. And then we've got lymphatic system and immunity. And that one's really 2 lectures I have just really pared the bejesus out of down, giving us some the major tenets of the lymphatic system. When it comes to the immune system, the 22 part of it, there's a lot that goes in that. And honestly, you get that in another class that you take generally on campus at Longview. So in the past, I've not had to do a huge amount of lecturing on it because honestly, you get more of it in the micro class. But with a different instructor, I'm not quite sure how they are organizing the class. So, so there's a little bit more meat to that. Just some basic understanding as to the components of the immune system, how it gets initiated, and what constitutes the immune response. Say, seeing it for the first time, cellular fight off, or is it more of an antibody response? So there's a lot of kind of fun, excuse me, aspects of immunity. And I may do a short little lecture on a couple different parts of that so we can kind of get into some of that and make sure we stay on task here. So we have blood vessels today, and we're going to look at that. And there's a good chunk of this lecture that we are not going to go over. You can see it. There's a huge amount of slides here. Honestly, the stuff at the very end is really more for you guys when you are studying this stuff. If you guys can work out a flow chart in your head, and the previous textbook had a really good flow chart, and I think this one does as well. Flow charts are going to be fantastic for how to get a visual representation in your mind of what these blood vessels are, not necessarily what, but where these blood vessels are. Because a blood vessel is just, it goes and it runs the course of the body. And as it runs through different regions, we'll just give it slightly different names. So as long as you kind of understand and know that, it's blood vessels is really pretty easy. So at the very end, I have a lot of kind of explanation and pictures. And that's really to kind of get a better understanding of where they're at, especially when you're doing them for the lab exam, to kind of get a visualization of kind of where the body is, because they're just going to show you a region. If you've been looking at those, they're just going to show you a region, and they are, and if you kind of understand aorta, ascending, the arch, the descending or the thoracic aorta, diaphragm, abdominal aorta, and first major trunk celiac, and then blah, 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 blah. Understanding that concept will allow you to figure out what you're identifying. It makes it a lot easier. But I digress. Let's get to the beginnings part of this here. What are the blood vessels? Well, they're arteries, they're veins, and they're capillaries. And if we talk about it in order, arteries, capillaries, veins. Arteries always carry blood from the heart. Veins always transport blood to the heart, from the capillaries to the heart. Okay, veins to the heart. Arteries away from the heart. All right. Oxygenated or deoxygenated, we've already established that. It depends. Pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins, right? Capillaries, we'll look at these a little bit later. This is where exchange is occurring. This is where that gas exchange is occurring within the body. Fluid exchange, nutrient exchange, gas exchange, waste exchange, the exchange process. That's how we get the good stuff out and the bad stuff, metabolic waste, into the blood vessels. And we can take it to, the lungs to exhale it, or to the kidneys and filter it out. So we're going to be looking at those processes today for that. We're going to look at blood pressure, how that's regulated. So there's a lot of stuff that culminates here today in what we've been talking about in the brainstem, with the medulla, with the pons. There's a lot of stuff that we are going to look talking about regulating blood pressure today and how the body does that. And so this continues on what we kind of looked at and how the heart gets affected by the body. Parasympathetic and sympathetic, right? The autonomic nervous system. We're going to add a little bit more to that today, because obviously these will be affected as well by sympathetic and parasympathetic. But there's a number of other things that can affect these things as well. Short term, long term, locally, globally. So there's a lot of fun stuff that happens here within the body, just in these boring old little bitty blood vessels. So when we look at these blood vessels, whether they're an artery or a vein, they will have generally 3 different layers. Okay, the only one that doesn't have 3 layers is the capillary, and that's where diffusion is primarily occurring. So really only 1 layer there. But these 3 layers or coats are called tunics. Tunica intima, the innermost. Tunica media, the middle, muscular. M of media, M of middle, M of muscular. And the most external one, the tunica externa. Depending upon the type of artery and the type of vein, depends on how big these 3 tunics are. And we'll talk about that as we keep going here. In the center, okay. L for lumen, okay? The lumen is just the center of the tube right here. And that's where the blood is obviously traveling through. Ta-da, you all know that though. If we look at the tunica intima, I mean, it is the innermost layer, like I said, but really, I mean, this is kind of the big thing here. It is a single layer of flat-shaped cells, and that's referred to as the endothelium, okay? So if we say the endothelium, we are talking about simple squamous epithelium. Simple means what?
1 layer.
1 layer. Squamous means what?
Multiple layers, many layers.
Flat
Squamous.
shape.
Oh, sorry.
Or, well,
It's like square shaped.
no, it's
Oh,
What's this?
columnar,
What's
Yeah.
this?
cuboidal,
Cuboidal. And then what's this?
squamous.
There you go. Squamous, flat shaped. So it would make sense that, you know, capillaries are really just a single layer of simple squamous epithelium. That's where gas exchange is occurring. Quick. Got to be quick. Okay. So innermost layer, simple squamous epithelium comprise it. It's referred to as endothelium. Arteries and veins can have a underlying layer called the subendothelial layer. It's a little bit of just loose connective tissue. All it is just it attaches the endothelial layer to the underlying layers below it. I don't know if it's a huge thing to remember. Understanding that tunica intima is referred to as endothelium and a simple squamous epithelium, that's probably something more important to remember. Again, tunica media is the middle layer, and it is the muscular layer, okay? Specifically smooth muscle. This is going to be the layer that is actively vasoconstricting and vasodilating. Okay. And then the outermost layer is areolar or loose connective tissue. Okay. There will be a few elastic fibers, and it just depends on the type of blood vessel. I will say that up front. It depends on the type of blood vessel, how much elastic fibers there are, how many collagen fibers there are. So it just depends. But it's really, the externa there is just to really ultimately define it, but it helps to anchor the blood vessels to some other structures so they kind of stay in one place. The one thing to remember as we talk about this is usually arteries and veins run together. Arteries, veins, nerves, they generally run together in same compartments. So when you find the artery, you usually find the vein right next to it. And this tunica externa helps to anchor it around to the adjacent structures. That's all it does. In your big blood vessels, okay, in your huge arteries, and you know, for a lesser extent, some of the bigger veins, but there's not too many of those. We have in this outermost layer what's called vasovasorum, and that means blood vessels, blood vessels. because some of the bigger arteries are way too big for simple diffusion to work, they need a blood vessel supply. And this is what it is: blood vessels, blood vessels. So on the outside of some of your more bigger arteries that we're going to be talking about here, some of the more elastic arteries, or maybe some of the thicker muscular arteries, maybe to some extent, you'll see blood vessels coursing around the outside of those. And those are blood vessels, vasorum. Arteries, veins, capillaries, oh my, again, contains only the tunica intima, so it's only endothelial. It's only one layer, so there's really nothing to anchor it down to anymore. So it doesn't have a subendothelial layer, but again, as long as you know it's one layer thick, that's all I really need you to know. I mean, it's one layer thick for what it really does. It allows for a rapid gas and nutrient exchange. Okay. If I add more layers to that, it's not going to be rapid anymore. Okay. It's not going to be rapid anymore. So that kind of defeats the purpose. Arteries generally have all three layers. Veins generally have all three layers. How much externa and media layers there are, or tunics there are, depends on the size of the artery or the vein. Generally, arteries always will have a thicker tunica media layer. Okay, so they are going to be much more affected by autonomic inputs. Okay, and depending on the type of artery you have, you will have elastic fibers that will stretch when accepting a large volume of blood. The aorta would be a great example of an elastic artery. It is right there as the blood ejects out of that left ventricle. So it takes on a lot of force and a lot of blood. So it would make sense that that's an elastic type of artery, as we'll see here in a second. Common iliac accepts all the blood going into the leg. So it's going to be more elastic in nature. So again, it will have more elastic fibers, more collagen fibers. It's taking a lot more of the force from the heart, because the heart is pumping, pushes that blood, and it pushes it out against the blood vessels, these arteries here. So these are going to be the ones that are going to need more collagen and elastic compared to a vein. Vein have less elastic and collagen fibers, but they're able to expand a whole hell of a lot. They have very large lumens, and honestly, veins are the huge reservoir for blood within the body. The vast majority of blood is found predominantly more in veins than it is in arteries, because it has a very large lumen, because it lacks a huge amount of tunica media. And here from the picture, you can see that, yep, a very thin tunica media layer. Excuse me, gosh. A very thin tunica media layer. And all of those veins, and a much thicker tunica media layer, and really all of those arteries. And as you get further and further away from the heart, they get smaller and smaller and smaller.